Hi, everyone. My name is Sylvia Boschetto, and in this presentation, I'm planning to discuss inclusion, diversity, and equality and how it relates to team performance. Now, this is based on my experience of leading and managing diverse teams, plus that gained through a role that I recently held as Chair of Equality and Diversity Steering Group for the IMEC. Now, I'd like to start with a few terms, particularly starting with equality, diversity, and inclusion. So equality had been the focus until recently through regulations and policies, such as the 2010 Equality Act. These policies and regulations are about ensuring equal opportunity for all and supporting minority groups. The Equal Opportunity Act of 2010 applies to all employers in England, Wales and Scotland and prohibits discrimination and unfair treatment of people on the grounds of age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex or sexual orientation. Now, in other countries, they have their own regulations and policies and take different positions. And this presentation won't cover these. But those dealing with other countries should make sure that they're familiar with them. Now, on a diversity perspective, diversity was the next area to be focused on. Diversity has been managed and measured to see how successful our policies and regulations are. We now have targets for recruitment, leadership, sectors and skills in all aspects listed by the Equality Act. Through recruiting and measuring diverse representation, the belief was that having this diversity would help to increase productivity and business growth through generating new ideas, innovations, and opportunities. What has actually been found is that we need to do more than just adding diversity to our teams. These diverse teams also need to be included. This was reiterated in a recent audit by Ernst & Young of the Royal Academy of Engineering's diversity program. Now then, inclusion, as I've said, is taking a much more prominent position. It's now a key focus for the Royal Academy of Engineering in their diversity program. And inclusion is about belonging, making people feel welcome. It is difficult to measure and difficult to solve, which is probably why it has not been a main focus to date. To ensure people feel included and welcome, we also need to develop trust. And all of these will be different for different people. Doing this can then encourage loyalty and a greater will to work within a team or organization and to grow that organization. Another term you will possibly have heard of is unconscious bias. The unconscious mind is more powerful than the conscious mind and uses shortcuts to make almost instant decisions. These shortcuts are based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experience. However, it can be wrong a lot of the time. Using an example from the Royal Society video on unconscious bias, consider a bat and a ball, which equals £1.10. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much would the ball cost? Now, many people would actually say that the ball costs 10p, when actually the answer is 5p. We choose the answer without thinking, and our unconscious mind makes a decision based on instinct rather than analysis. Our unconscious mind is fallible and is also biased, making instant judgments on people we meet, categorizing them based on gender, social background, ethnicity, or what hobbies they like, and so on. There are various examples. One story is about a former U.S. senator of African-American descent who was being mistaken for a waiter at a cocktail party. Another was of an IMEC fellow for an events administrator, all because of how they looked or were dressed. These are examples of both unconscious bias and unconscious emotion, another term sometimes used which talks about when we assume someone is less than they are based on how they look or appear. Now, in seconds, we can decide if people belong to our group or not. We may choose people to join our group who are male or female or people with more power, no matter what their background. And women could even choose a man over a woman. So why is it all this important? Well, a team is like a jigsaw puzzle. Picking the right pieces and ensuring they fit together effectively means a team can be more or do more, which also means an organization is better than it was before. And choosing the right person can be more than the skills and information on paper, and we need to ensure we are rational in our choices. By improving our inclusion and diversity and equality and reducing our unconscious bias within our organizations and teams, we can reduce costs such as sickness days, risks, accidents and failures, and even staff turnover, while increasing productivity through increasing motivation and idea generation, health and safety, and even enlarging our recruitment pool. This is because breadth in a team brings more perspectives from which to generate ideas and solutions. Also, if these people feel included and trusted and trust their management, they are also motivated, and this can improve their mental and emotional well-being. Therefore, less health and sickness and health and safety risks. Part of improving diversity and inclusion and reducing unconscious bias, we need to understand how we are performing now and where we want to progress to. To do this, we can use this model to evaluate our current cultural paradigm and devise a future idea of where we want to be. The model helps us consider the representation of our taken for granted assumptions or paradigm of our team and organization. The idea is to look holistically at the stories we tell, the symbols we use, rituals and routines, power structures and control systems alongside the organizational structure to try and understand where we are and where we want to be. When we look at stories, they are those that are told by members to each other, to outsiders, to new recruits, and so on. One story in a multinational company was that if you didn't reach a certain level by 40, then you would not progress further in that organization. Now, this could be turned around into everyone's experience is valued. Time could be spent investigating why promotions don't happen for people over 40. Those that are promoted could be interviewed to understand why and how their stories communicated. Now, one of the other things is symbols. Now, symbols are logos, offices, how the office is constructed, cars and titles, or even the type of language and terminology that's commonly used, which then becomes shorthand of the nature of the organization. For example, in a perceived conservative organization, there may be many symbols of hierarchy or deference, like formal office layout, differences in privileges between levels of management, the way in which people address each other, and so on. One company used floor-to-ceiling partitions to separate departments in a single floor office, and that tended to segregate certain departments and constrain them from talking to each other. It is often difficult to change a layout in an office, although other things could be that you change titles, ensure all your communications support those with dyslexia. Maybe you have a maternity rest room or faith room, or even provide longer paid paternity leave than beyond the statutory. Routines are ways that individuals and members within an organization behave towards each other, those outside, and make up the way we do things around here. For example, in one company, although they advertised roles within the organization, they actively encouraged networking as a preferred way of acquiring your next role. And this could potentially make people feel that there wasn't a merit to how roles were brought about, or that it was lack of transparency. Rituals are special events used to emphasize what is particularly important and reinforces, again, the way we do things around here. These could be golf days or similar to enable networking. One, organized paddleboarding or other active events as team building. These could exclude some people and promote that these have to be your interest to be part of the team. Power structures are most normally associated with the key assumptions of the paradigm. So the paradigm is really the formula for success for the organization, which is taken for granted and likely, if it's a big company, to have grown up over a number of years. the most powerful managerial groupings within the organisation are likely to be closely associated with these core sets of assumptions and beliefs. Again, control systems, another component to be considering, is the measures and reward systems we use to emphasise what is important and where attention should be focused. So to think about it, it's about how you are rewarding your team and what that culture, that reward is actually promoting. Think about the targets you're setting and so on. Now, organisational structure is very much linked to power structures and highlights the importance and emphasises the importance of relationships within an organisation. Now, this tool is more of a guide that can be used to try and bring out some of the key points around your organisation and try and determine where you want to be in terms of key areas and try and give you some focus. But on slide 8, I'd like to say that a few other points that might be more useful to you as well, more specifically around improving inclusion and diversity in recruiting and retention and team integration. When recruiting, we can consider the current gaps you have and look beyond the technical skills. Think about the personalities, where you need to have a detail-oriented person, type of background, maybe other attributes besides technical ones. For example, maybe you are targeting a new demographic or a country with a new product. So having someone on the team who has experience or is from that demographic might be useful. For example, mini excavators are often operated by people ranging from below 5 foot or 150 centimetres to above 6 foot, and sometimes they're women. So it has been helpful to have these perspectives within the team. Think about where they need to work and when. Someone who does data entry maybe doesn't need to be in the office and could be home-based. This could then open the role for someone who is physically disabled and finds it difficult to get into the office. Further, think about expanding your networks. What about contacting networks such as WES and WISE, Women Engineering Society and Women in Science and Engineering, to access women's networks in engineering? Or Inter-Engineering to access LGBT networks? And there are also returners, refugee, dyslexic, autistic, and disability organisations that can all provide input and support to help broaden the recruitment pool. Besides recruitment, retention is also important. Here we can think about how we obtain feedback, what we do with it, how do we develop trust with our team, remembering that everyone is different. This is where we need to think about managing the individual because everyone comes with their own experiences and values, and therefore how we build trust and help them feel they belong will be different. When looking at team integration, review the environment. Ask your team for input. This will also help them feel more included because they've actually felt that they've contributed to any changes that may occur. Provide support, mentoring and coaching, but for both the team and the management. Also make sure managers and leaders have enough time and encouragement to develop their team. Some leaders and managers are very new and need that extra coaching and support. And they still believe sometimes, particularly in an engineering or technical environment, that a large component of their role should still be technical. One new director I managed, when asked, believed that the majority of his time, over 60%, should be technical advisory, when I believed the opposite. And the only way we would have understood this was by asking each other and discussing it. So thanks for listening, and I'd like to open the floor now for any questions that anyone might have. Hello, open for any questions. So I've had a question from somebody who wanted to ask about another term which I didn't mention on the presentation, which is around microaggressions. Now, I don't know how many people have heard of this, but this is more around when we get a continuation of small things that are given to us over time. So say, for example, we have jokes continuously over time that maybe in one joke they actually don't mean much, but if we continue to get them over time, we start to think in a certain way. Maybe it's a joke about being female in a male environment, and maybe it's cultural jokes. And over time, they make us feel like we really don't want to come forward with ideas and so on. So that's a question from one person. Now, potentially another question might be that I've had before and somebody's come up with again is around developing trust. Like I said on the presentation, it's a very difficult one to do, but it's very individual. So I'm not sure I can give a conclusive answer here. But one thing I will say, it's around trying to feel and understand the individual in your team. Maybe take them aside one-to-one on occasions and ask them how things are going and how they feel about things. I mean, as engineers, we don't normally ask about feelings, but that's something that we should be starting to ask a bit more. Maybe just in general conversation, ask them what they did on the weekend, those sorts of things, to try and get an understanding of what things are important to them and are of interest. And ask them their opinion on where the team might need to go and what they think could be done differently, and maybe implement some of those things. I mean, obviously, if they're appropriate, but through actions, we can sometimes create a better position of trust between the team member and the manager or the leader. Because often, as a member, we struggle to sometimes trust our employer because we know that they have a potential veto over our employment. So we're more cautious. Whereas as a team leader, we're in a power position. So sometimes we need to maybe give a little bit on our power base. So that's another question that's coming through. I'm just going to check to see what other questions. Oh, okay. So here we go. We've got another question here. What tools are available to change cultures when people are at senior level? When people at senior level are resistant to making changes to practices. You can't keep waiting for them to retire. Well, again, now this is going back to trying to understand your boss and understanding what it is that they want out of working in the company and what they want from you. And in some ways, maybe trying to work towards what they want to have done and what they want from you. And from then, you're building trust with them as well. And then from that, they can potentially be more open to listening to some of your ideas. I think that's always a challenge. Challenge is trying to change from the bottom up, which is always a more difficult way of doing change. But it is about, again, trying to understand your boss, who is your customer for all the work, and what it is that they want, and maybe using that to try and get things moving. Another one here finds that diversity events are attended by people who are already interested in diversity, and there is a narrower and narrower range of people attending. How do we encourage very busy managers and employees to attend? Well, I think the other thing might be to actually encourage them to attend more online events, because again, like you've said, it's they're very busy people, and they need to understand, or they need to have the time to do it. So a short event like mine here, which is only 15 minutes, is possible. The other thing is to explain to them how they are still diverse as well, because in a lot of cases, a lot of people don't attend these events because they think that it doesn't mean anything to them because they're not one of the diversity groups. But actually they are, and they could be in the future. One company was talking about how they had employees who were undergoing cancer treatment. Now, in that case, they became a diverse minority because people needed to understand the impact and effect of that process on the way they were working. So any of us could be one of our diverse group at any particular period of time. So the slides, apparently the slides should be available through the iMakeE, so you'll be able to get a recording and review it later. So that's from that point of view. And then another one here is interested in cultural environment model. Oh, okay. So the cultural model that I've used is actually based on a model that's used by Cranfield School of Management, which is around the cultural web. And there's a book that you can access, which is called Exploring Corporate Strategy by Jerry Johnson and Kevin Scholes. That's Scholes. And then there are a number of examples around how to use this particular model in cultural change. So hopefully that'll help you. Another one here, don't know how appropriate. There are situations, certain individuals direct criticisms towards their targets only and not other people. Those can be seen as personal, which is rather irritating. This is something my manager or I can do. So I think what I understand from this is that sometimes you find that some people are almost getting bullied, and that it's directed strictly at particular people. I think in those sort of cases, you maybe need to take those people aside and have a one-to-one conversation and try and understand why the conversations and the criticisms are being made, and maybe it's not necessarily that they realize they're doing it. Maybe it's an unconscious thing. So I think it's about understanding why, and if they understand their impact first, and then figuring out maybe what you can do about it. Next one here, companies having set quotas on diversity potentially. Yeah, so I get this question a bit around diversity quotas. The challenge is, we've used quotas, as I said, for diversity management and measurement, and sometimes we don't always necessarily get the right people just because of their background and everything else. We may be not always getting the right people from what their background is. And having been one side, I've been brought in because I was female, and another time I actually saw somebody else had been brought in because they were female, and that had a negative impact. So it's about what you're trying to target and what you're trying to achieve. I'm not saying the targets are necessarily a wrong thing to do. You just need to be really careful about what outcome you're trying to achieve, not necessarily just bringing somebody in for their particular diversity background, but also making sure that you're doing it in the right way so that it doesn't, one, have a negative impact on that diversity demographic, which it can and it has had on some women in the past, but also so that you're actually getting that mix of both diversity in terms of the Equality Act, but also diversity in terms of thinking, because we want both. And just because someone is female doesn't mean that they necessarily think differently to other females that are in the business that you already have there already. So it's really about a balancing act and thinking about the quotas and what you're trying to achieve. Okay, I'm going to try and find another question here. So another question is, what have we got here? Hang on a second. So just going to go onto that particular cultural web that I mentioned and give you a bit more points, because somebody was asking more about some of the specifics of how it's put together. So just so that the power piece, for example, is actually more about, or it can be more about how you generate power and how you develop power. So in one case, it could be that it's based on your connections or the boss's connections. And so all the power then is through that person's connections with clients and so on. And if that person leaves, the power goes with them.
So that's a bit of an example about power. And in a way, you could almost bring in a knowledge management system or some way of disengaging that direct connection from a client management point of view, which might help. Another thing around organization, maybe you've got a very complex matrix type of organization, or maybe it's a hierarchical organization, and it's trying to understand what sort of organization you want to go to. Do you want to be an organization that's responsive and flexible to what clients are saying to you, or do you want very clear positioning on everything? Do you want a formal network or something else, and so on? So yeah, it can be a very broad sort of thing, but the idea of this cultural web is that you can start figuring out and teasing out the key things that you want to see in your organization. And if you figure out what you've got at the moment, you can then work out the steps that will take you from the power structure that you have at the moment to the power structure you want to have in the future. And it starts to bring it down into a much more step-by-step and manageable process. So the person who was talking about how to change cultures when people are at a senior level maybe aren't listening as they would like, this could be another way of looking at it and putting that in front of them and say, well, look, I've had a look at the way we do things in here and in particular ways and particular things, and I know we want to go to X situation where maybe we want to be more productive or so on. To do that, we're going to have to be changing our structure to be a certain way. So that this could actually give that person an analytical way of presenting to their boss how things could be beneficial if we did some change. So another question I have here is around staff support networks in retaining diverse networks in diverse workforces. So I think the thing is that retaining people is very much around, do those people feel like they belong in this organization? Do they feel that what they're doing is of value? Do they feel that, this organization is going the same way that they want to go? So if networks are helping those people to feel more welcome, then you're potentially going to be retaining people. The only thing I would add to that, though, is that there's a piece around making sure people don't feel excluded through having all those networks. Some organizations have gone to what they call diversity networks rather than necessarily specific networks, and then enabling people from LGBT to mix with people from women's networks and so on. Because one of the other things is that by creating networks, we're starting that group thing where we create a group and we say, well, you're all like us, so we're going to include you in our group. But we miss out on the other people who are not like us, so we're excluding. So it's about having that balance again and making an awareness that we're trying to do that. Now, one organization, what they developed was, again, like I said, more of a diversity network. Nominally, it was started as a women's network, but what they did was they opened it up to a broader demographic of diversity and said, look, a lot of the things that we're doing around coaching, presentation skills, how to network, all those sorts of things, well, they apply to everybody, no matter where you come from. And what we want to do is we want to encourage everybody to be able to engage better and to work together better than we have before. So they opened it up. So there's still the opportunity to connect with people who have a similar background, but you're doing it within a broader, diverse network. So you're still gaining the value of having other diversities in there. I hope that helps answer that question. So I'm just going to look for another question here. Okay, so just checking to see what other questions we have. Another one is, well, going back on that retention point as well, it's not just about having the diverse networks. It's also about making sure that your people feel properly trained, that they feel fully supported, that, like I said, their movements are going in the direction of the organization itself. They feel that, you know, they don't have to go and network within a golfing day to feel that they're actually going to get further forward, all those sorts of things. But even down to the listening point where you're ensuring trust. Again, it's about those sorts of things that then bring people together and make people feel like, yes, this organization isn't just about the organization, it's about individuals as well. Something that Richard Branson just said recently was that he believes that by looking after his employees will look after his business. And I think that's the way we probably should be thinking about it, is that if we want to retain, if we're looking at retention, if we help those people to feel welcome, they feel looked after, they feel supported, then they're going to look after the business for you without you necessarily being standing over them to try and make sure that they're doing it. So you're creating a culture that requires you to do less management, to be honest, because you're empowering your team to do the best that they can for the organization. So, okay, just going to look to see if there's anything else coming through. Okay, so and something else somebody else has just put through is around when we talk about groups and so on. One person was asking about having women who pull other men in rather than bringing women up through. I mean, there's a couple of expressions called. One is the queen bee syndrome. Once a woman has got to a certain level, she sometimes forgets and doesn't necessarily help. So that's the queen bee syndrome. And the other one is the rope ladder syndrome. So there's a couple of expressions that sort of fit with the unconscious bias component of this presentation, where we were talking about women bringing women into their power groups, bringing men into their power groups rather than women. That's where that normally comes from. And another one here, best way to encourage okay. All right, so again, this is a question that is very similar to something we talked about before, but again, we're talking about trying to bring in people from different diversity areas. It really is about making them aware that it's not just women, or it's not just people with disabilities, or various other things that that makes them diverse. I mean, one of the examples I used was about age. The person over 40 is told that they can't go any further. I mean, that's an age thing that applies to both men and women, no matter what the color of their skin or whether they're disabled or not. So everybody has an aspect of diversity. And the thing is, from a women engineering point of view, it's about making sure that men realize that actually women are 50% of the customer base. and that, one of the examples I used was that women use mini excavators just as much as men do. So women are part of that customer base. We need to understand what that customer base wants, and actually having women in engineering and working within an engineering company or an engineering team in designing a product is actually useful. So it's a benefit to both sort of groups. So it should be that we're just individuals, we're just an engineer, and that's the way of where it should go to. But I think it's going to probably take a bit of time. I don't know. There's not really an easy answer to trying to get around the sort of women engineering thing, you get it, and I assume that it's probably more younger women who are also getting pointed out more and brought forward more to show that they're an example of, a female that's working in their environment. I mean, I remember when I was working on submarines, again, I'd be almost patted on the head as we have a woman on our team. It was such an unusual thing to have. But I think it's becoming a lot less, and that over time it'll become less and less. So hopefully that'll change. And yes, the queen bee syndrome. Somebody made a comment that it happens everywhere. So it's not just an at work thing, and it's not just an engineering thing. It's everywhere. But it's one thing to be aware that just because someone in charge is a woman doesn't necessarily mean that that person will bring more women through. Part of their unconscious bias could be that they're attracted to more male-oriented co-workers than to female co-workers, and they maybe struggle working with women. So I'm going to have a look a bit further. I'm just going to look at a few more questions. So on the recruitment side, I mean, one of the things that I mentioned there was trying to expand your networks. One of the things that is often mentioned is that, well, we just don't have enough women coming through who want a job, so therefore we can't recruit more women. Well, the thing is, where have you actually gone and looked? We usually go and look in our own networks because it's easier, and our HR recruitment people will go and look in their own networks because it's easier. And so we need to try and look at different ways of bringing people forward, and various social media networks allow you to put algorithms in that will allow you to trawl for different types of people from different sectors. We can go to different networks, go beyond our engineering networks, go beyond our sector networks. We often talk about, trying to hire engineers, but we don't normally go beyond our sector to look. We don't think about the lateral perspective. So maybe there's more women in a different sector that we could bring forward. Maybe there's more disabled people in a different sector that we could bring through. So those are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about as well in terms of broadening our recruitment network. And somebody's just made a really good point here about how your vacancy is written as well. A lot of people will write their job description, and they'll write it with all the acronyms and expressions of their business, when actually they won't necessarily think about whether they really need somebody who understands all those acronyms or has that sort of background. And actually also those acronyms can put somebody off from a different sector because they don't realize that they're just the same. It's just a lateral thing that they could still do just based on what they do. So, for example, maybe you use a different term for project management processes and so on from one sector to another, and you're missing out on a sector because you've used the project management process terminology in your company, or you've used the name of the position title of what it is in your company, which means something completely different to somebody else. So think about how you can be broader in what you're putting in your job description. As people who are putting our CVs into different sectors or trying to get jobs, we're always told to try and target where we're going to. Well, think a bit more broadly and think, well, actually, does my job description only target people who look like me? And maybe that will also help you to attract people. I think the other thing, one job I looked at once was looking at cost reduction. So looking at how the company could reduce costs in their product. And they started out talking about innovation, and they wanted someone innovative, broad thinking, etc., etc. And then they said, but must have experience in the technology that we're doing. Well, actually, maybe they didn't need to have a person with that experience in that particular technology to give that breadth of thinking and new ideas and innovations. So they missed out on a possible demographic. I know it put me off because I didn't have that experience at the time. So that's a thing to think about. So another question here. Okay, so yes, the imposter syndrome. Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think that this is just a female thing either. I mean, we say that men don't struggle with this either, but there are some men who I've seen who could be a lot more senior than where they are, but they've had their confidence beaten so many times that they struggle to get over as well. So the imposter syndrome is it's going to be a difficult one because everybody's going to be different in terms of how much confidence building they need. Some of us are more naturally confident than others, and maybe it's just that we've had a few knocks and we need to get over those few knocks. Other people maybe have always found it a bit of a challenge, and it's through consistent and long-term support that they've gone to the position they are. So it's about trying to understand, I think, a little bit about the individual, what it is that has knocked their confidence, what it is that makes them feel like they're an imposter in their own situation, and then trying to overcome those particular points and trying to maybe put them in supported situations where they can prove to themselves that they're not an imposter, or prove to themselves that they can be successful in that sort of situation. So it is a challenging thing, but I think it's also an individual thing. So it really needs to be understanding that first point, what it is that's actually taking them to that position, and then helping them to get over those bits. And it may be in some cases that you need to do that in small steps. In other cases, it may be that one or two occasions actually make them feel much more confident and capable than they did before. Maybe it's a case of just getting more affirmation that they're capable of achieving. Awards is another way of maybe doing it, maybe encouraging them or putting them forward for certain awards that enable them to see other people affirming that they're capable. Because often it can be that a person actually is much more confident with external affirmation. So it's about understanding the individual, I think, as well. So have a look to see if there's any other questions. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of the session. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending and for listening and for the wonderful questions that everybody's put forward. I hope this has answered as many as I can. And please feel free to listen again to the presentation online. Thank you.